Very simplified for understanding the context. This year, Russia earns between 500 and 600 million euros every day from exporting all fossil fuels. Approximately 200 to 250 million of this amount comes from crude oil sales, 80% of which goes to two countries, China and India, and a little more is taken by the European Union and Turkey. The exact percentages are on your screen. The sale of petroleum products such as diesel and fuel oil generates around an additional 200 million daily. But here, the main buyers are Turkey, which takes 26% of Russia's total exports, China with 13%, and Brazil with another 12%. Therefore, if the goal is to limit the revenues of the Russian budget, it's important to remember that the export of petroleum products brings Russia only slightly less than the export of crude oil. But is there any chance to at least somewhat reduce these two streams that feed the Russian war machine? And, recently at least there is some hope for that. And it's all thanks to the smart policy of this wonderful woman, Ursula von der Leyen. Let me explain.
We raised the important issue of China's support for Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. This has a direct and dangerous impact on Europe's security. And together, we expressed hope that China will respond to our concerns and use its influence to make Russia agree to a ceasefire, come to the negotiating table, start peace talks, and put an end to the bloodshed. How China continues to engage with Putin will be a defining factor in our future relations.
Just so you understand, this statement was made by Ursula von der Leyen on the sidelines of the European Union-China summit held in Beijing. The event was originally planned to last 2 days, but it was shortened to just 1 day. After all, the European Union's tough stance left China with no chance to make, if you will, a breakthrough on the geopolitical chessboard. And there were all the prerequisites for that. As you know, Donald Trump, upon entering the White House, first questioned the United States' commitment to NATO principles, and then even started a trade war with the European Union. China viewed this as an opportunity to attract Europe to its side, with apparent benefits. Beijing could offer the European Union security guarantees by restraining Putin from attacking, and a willingness for a more pragmatic dialogue on trade agreements. In fact, Xi Jinping offered European democracies a deal, security and profitable trade in exchange for a shift in foreign policy priorities. It would seem that the pampered Europeans could well agree to such a compromise to preserve their usual way of life, but that was not the case. The European Union-China summit is a total failure. Ms. von der Leyen clearly states that before Beijing can discuss trade relations with the European Union, it must bring Putin to the negotiating table. But there's more.
Today we are talking about trade between the European Union and the United States of America. Together, we represent the two largest economies in the world. If you look at the trade volumes, this is the largest trade flow on the planet, amounting to $1.7 trillion between us.
Just 3 days after the European Union-China summit, Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump announced a new trade agreement. The parties agreed on 15% tariffs on most European goods. The industrial agreement also includes significant investment commitments. European companies must purchase American energy resources worth $750 billion within 3 years and invest another $600 billion in the United States. Although the second part is in question. Of course, such conditions are an objective economic blow to Europe, but under the current circumstances, Ms. von der Leyen got the most out of what was possible. But of course, I don't look at this agreement through the prism of European business interests. What's more important here is that Washington and Brussels have brought their positions closer together, which directly affects Trump's decisions regarding Russia. Remember, I asked you in this video not to forget to thank the Israeli pilots. If a couple of weeks after a successful operation against Iran, old Donnie gets tougher on Putin, that's exactly what happened. So thanks again to the Israeli Air Force. Well, the reduction of the ultimatum to 12 days for the Kremlin dictator from the 47th President of the United States is already thanks to Ms. Ursula. So, Dankeschön. After all, of course, Trump's current change of position is the result of long discussions and persuasion from European leaders and the principled stance of the President of the European Commission, who refused to agree to an easy but onerous deal with China. And now the question is, what happens next?
The new deadline from today will be 10 to 12 days. There's no reason to wait 50 days. I want to be generous, but we just don't see any progress.
Of course, I think you understand that Trump's change in rhetoric is not just the result of moralizing lectures from democratic capitals about the heroic struggle of the victim against the cruel aggressor. Donald thinks differently in evergreen categories. Europe offered the New York developer a good deal. As per the trade agreement, the European Union must purchase energy resources from the United States valued at $750 billion over 3 years, equating to $250 billion annually. But how can this be implemented if the European Union spent $375 billion on energy resources in 2024? The United States supplies a significant 45% of liquefied gas, earning Washington about $54 billion. But the main share of crude oil and petroleum products, which are more expensive than gas, the European Union receives from other countries: Norway, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Libya. These supplies are often carried out under previously agreed futures contracts. That is, in order to purchase energy resources from the States for $250 billion a year, it would be necessary to almost completely abandon other sources, and that's impossible. Does this mean that Brussels simply tricked Trump? Rather, it looks like a cold calculation here. Now, when Europe fails to increase purchases of American energy resources, they will point fingers at people like Orban and Fico, at leaders who continue to buy Russian oil. Yes, when we first analyzed the European Union's crude oil purchase chart, we had to consider this specific column. This is mainly the import of black gold into countries like Hungary and Slovakia.
Orban claims Trump, the Republican presidential candidate, plans to end the war by not supporting Ukraine. Orban claims Trump won't fund the Ukrainian-Russian war, and without United States support, Europeans can't finance it alone.
There was supposed to be a joke here about an old prostitute who, due to her age, can't serve 2 clients at once. But while the war is going on, I try to refrain from using humor in my videos. In other words, the European Union is doing everything to get Trump interested in pushing Russian energy resources out of its market. And at the same time, to solve its own, so to speak, internal party problems created by 2 pro-Russian leaders. Of course, the 8 billion euros that Slovakia and Hungary spend on purchasing energy resources from Russia won't allow Brussels to fulfill the promises it made to Trump. But that's not all. At the beginning of the video, we talked about the fact that the main buyer of Russian oil products is not China, but Turkey. But of course, this is a common scheme for bypassing sanctions, because in reality, oil products in Turkish ports are simply re-registered to companies from somewhere in Ankara and then sent on to Europe. They also aim to force them out of the European Union market by launching multi-billion-dollar fraud investigations against them. You might wonder about Brussels' stake in this. Isn't it preferable to purchase cheaper hydrocarbons from Russia or Turkey on paper rather than pricier American ones? Well, that's a somewhat distorted perspective. Some people see relationships between countries as if they were relationships between individuals, but that's fundamentally wrong. European companies, not Ursula von der Leyen herself, purchase petroleum products from Ankara. It's impossible to punish them if all their documents are in order. But Brussels is indeed determined to break economic ties with Russia, as evidenced by the complete rejection of pipeline gas and the massive reduction in purchases of black gold. But bureaucratic loopholes sometimes prevent the complete eradication of such grey imports. That's exactly why heavy artillery in the form of Trump is needed, who, by the way, still hasn't secured a trade deal with Erdogan. And it's quite likely that European leaders will be able to convince Donald to put pressure on the Turkish Sultan and force him to abandon the scheme for re-exporting Russian oil products. Ultimately, this would benefit the United States by allowing the European Union to further increase purchases of American energy resources. But again, are the Europeans really doing this to help Ukraine, which is bleeding out? Well, I think there aren't many naive people among my audience. No, the Europeans want to help themselves because they really do feel a threat from Russia. As discussed in the last video, I understand that some of you took my points as alarmism, like, yeah, Putin won't attack NATO, he can't even take the Donetsk region. But damn, once again, it's not me talking about the threat to the European part of the alliance from the Russian Federation, it's the European intelligence services. Look, in France's new security strategy, it states that the threat of open war with Russia in the center of Europe by 2030 has become the main scenario. Russian cyber attacks on Europe persist, with sabotage at defense companies and in the Baltic Sea. Russian reconnaissance drones have been spotted flying over Lithuania. Well, and the magazine Bild quotes the words of the Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe, General Alexis Grinkevich. The general stated that the European Union and United States have only 18 months to prepare for a global military conflict with China and Russia. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping will deliver a coordinated and simultaneous strike. I just don't want you to take this and my previous videos as an attempt to scare anyone. No, Europe is already scared without me. And their attempts to push Trump toward more decisive action against Russia aren't because they care so much about Ukrainians and are trying their best to help them. No, they want to help themselves, and they're right to do so. The introduction of European Union sanctions against the Russian-owned Indian refinery in Gujarat is part of the aforementioned strategy. And Trump didn't take long to act either, imposing tariffs against India, including for buying Russian oil. But this is already serious. After all, let me remind you, 38% of all crude oil exported by Russia goes to India. But most importantly, as you know, the energy minister of that country has already assured that they are ready to give up supplies of black gold from Russia. And of course, this was an obvious assist to Trump ahead of the trade deal between Washington and New Delhi, which in turn will serve the interests of Europe and its citizens. Although not all Europeans realize this, as some don't understand it. Why overpay when you can buy Russian gas and petroleum products for less? And so in order for these very citizens not to be too outraged by Brussels' actions, such tricks are needed. They need Trump, who will be a bulldozer pushing Russian energy resources out of the European Union market. After all, once the democratic leaders realized that Russia is already de facto a proxy of China, it became vital to deprive Putin of the windfall profits that are funding the war.
China believes it is waging a proxy war with the help of Russia. And we can see in some statements from the Chinese government that they want to keep the United States and our allies occupied with this war so that we can't focus on other strategic objectives.
I hope you clearly understand that my entire previous speech wasn't about Russia instantly losing half of its hydrocarbon revenue in 8 days. No, it will be a very slow squeezing out of Russian energy resources from the huge European market, which will eventually lead to a reduction in Russia's budget. The notion that China would refuse to purchase Russian oil is not even a matter of debate. Precisely because for Beijing, a completely dependent, subordinate, and pro-Chinese Russia is an extremely important asset. It's their reliable proxy. In the previous video, we didn't finish discussing the main beneficiary of a potential Russian armed forces invasion, or militants without identification marks entering the territory of one of the NATO countries. This is, of course, China, which could take advantage of this conflict to invade the territory of Taiwan. This is the exact scenario General Alexis Grinkevich is referring to. And, of course, Russia can be used as a lever of pressure on Europe. Will Ursula von der Leyen be so principled when it comes to trade relations with China if Russian militants invade one of the Baltic countries? Won't the entire European bureaucratic apparatus then rush to Beijing, begging them to calm down the enraged bear? Xi Jinping may well consider such a scenario, since it is vital for China to bend Europe economically.
You know, the Chinese economy is going through a rather difficult period. Demand is weak, unemployment is rising, and growth has slowed down significantly. But in China, people have a better understanding of what is happening on the ground, and that all these phenomena need to be considered in a broader context. The driving forces of the Chinese economy for the past 20 to 30 years, or maybe even longer, have been real estate, which accounts for a quarter to a third of our gross domestic product, low-tech manufacturing, and consumer internet platforms that have emerged over the last 2 decades. They've run out of steam. That's why they had to make adjustments. And it's not just a regular adjustment, but a very fundamental one, to shift the economy to a new growth model. And now we're experiencing short-term, very intense pain, short-term and possibly even medium-term pain from this transition. But the transition is nevertheless necessary in the long term.
This is a transition that partly involves producing high-tech goods with high added value and then selling them to both Chinese consumers and the rest of the world. This inevitably creates tensions that will lead to increased geopolitical and economic disagreements with the West.
Perhaps...
Yes, the words of Eric Lee, the head of a major Chinese venture fund, explain China's interest in Europe better than anything else. There are indeed structural changes taking place in the Chinese economy. If recently the main drivers of growth were consumer goods and construction, today Beijing is trying to shift the economy to a new growth model by increasing the high-tech share of exports. But for this, high-margin sales markets are needed. If Chinese toys and clothing can be bought all over the world, selling things like cars requires a population with purchasing power. It only lives in developed countries. So China simply needs free access to the European market, but it is becoming more and more closed. The European Union is imposing protective tariffs, including on Chinese electric cars, because they are destroying its own production. And if you look at the chart of high-tech product exports, you can see that China is stagnating in this regard. This is influenced by both tariffs and the relocation of production. But if China wants to keep growing, if China wants to break out of the middle income trap, it needs to take over more and more solvent markets where it can sell high-tech products. By the way, it's funny that supposedly communist China might follow the logic that Marx criticized, according to which it is precisely capitalist states acting in the interests of their national corporations and financial elites that strive to gain access to new markets. But because of their limitations, this inevitably leads to major wars. So, it turns out that a dying China, if it wants to become a high-tech net exporter, might resort to an allegedly purely capitalist approach. And let's say to scare the European Union with its pet dog that it keeps on a leash. But how many Russians might perish in the fields somewhere near Vilnius so that Europe would remove tariffs on Chinese junk doesn't really concern the Great Dragon. But the thing is, it doesn't really bother Putin either, since he's ready to sacrifice his country's future. I quote, distracting the United States from China and destabilizing the West.
The mayor completed preparations for the concept of Russia's long-term socio-economic development until 2020. The main goal is still to double the gross domestic product, and there are also plans to reduce inflation to 3% per year. The document also emphasizes the social sphere. The average salary in Russia will increase from $526 to $2,700, and half of the population will be considered middle class. The transformations will occur in 3 phases. The next 4 years will be for preparation, followed by a dynamic 5-year period. From 2018 onward, we can rest on our achievements.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion, I have not once talked about the Russian economy and its resilience on this channel. After all, those who remember my old videos know that since 2017 I have always said that sanctions are not about forcing the dictator to stop the war. Back then it was about the hybrid war with Ukraine. No, sanctions act like weights that slow the country down while everyone else around continues to grow and develop. Unfortunately, Putin will not stop killing Ukrainians after Trump imposes secondary sanctions against countries that buy Russian oil. But it will definitely affect the duration and intensity of the slaughter, and that's already not bad. And when the war ends, the Russians involved in it will be busy for a long time cleaning up the chaos created by their own image. And this will give the countries around the perimeter of the Russian Federation time to distance themselves as much as possible from their neighbor and protect themselves from another Putin who might want to reclaim lost territories again. I hope they take advantage of this opportunity. Although, as always, it's up to them to decide whether to be or